Hi and welcome back to MDriven. I got a comment on one of the videos that working with MVC in .NET Core 3.1 wasn't crystal clear, and as I investigated I found that correct, it wasn't crystal clear, and we lacked some of the packaging of the MDriven framework for a good NuGet package for everything. So we've addressed that. So just gonna walk through the sample where we actually have an application in this is .NET 5, and .NET 5 is the replacement for .NET Core 3.1, so I'd suggest that you move to that if you haven't. And it was still a bit messy to create the ecospace etc. in the .NET 5 environment because I haven't managed to get the designers working properly. But the model is here, and you can do things with the model easily. And then we want to use this model. Let's see if we have package 1 here. We want to use package 1 in our ecospace. So let's see if we can do that, like here. And so we have the ecospace, and this is the only code right now because the designer isn't working. And to add the package, I use this ecospace package attribute on the ecospace type. So if I have multiple packages, I would just add them here. And the only thing I did from the standard template is to set the persistence mapper. And since I'm doing a simple test, I just created a persistence mapper to XML, and that's the easiest way to get going. And all the rest is as is. So let's see what we did on the web application. I just used the standard template for MVC. Yeah, and right on the assembly holding both the model and the ecospace, I have then added NuGet packages for MDriven link extender .NET standard. So having that, I can see that this one in turns make use of the handles and the interfaces, and also we use Newtonsoft. So all the assemblies are included in the one. If you pick the right one, you get all these. Okay, so I just made a standard application from the template and made some changes to that. In the dependencies, I added NuGet packages MVCCore, and if I were to check those dependencies, I can see that it depends on the handles and interfaces and link extender, and also .NET HTTP. And then there are some other things we need to get things going with the creation of the razor text for ViewModels. Okay. I'm heading over to the views. I just took the standard template and I added 3 different examples. One is objects directly, access the objects as you would in any other MVC project. So we can look at that first. For this we have a objects directly, we have a controller called objects directly. And in that controller the base class for that controller is a model-driven controller base, and sending in the type of our ecospace. So what this does for us is making sure that we have an established connection to the ecospace whenever we instantiate the controller. And we also have some pooling of these to speed things up, so you don't need to reconnect as much. And in the first index action, I create one of the objects from the model, and yeah, that's this one. And I set attribute 1, and here you can see I can access the ecospace or the service provider that's needed to create the class so that it's remembered in this ecospace. And then I do commit, or in this case commit skip validate, no big difference. And why I do this is to save the newly created object in this ecospace, so that navigating away and destructing this controller won't give me an error that I'm destroying unsaved objects. And then I send this to a view with root, and root is then my class 1. So let's see in the views. Here I have a view, and I have some usages, and this one is from the model library. It's this one. Oops, didn't mean to do that. And the control is not sure. Oh, maybe I don't need this. So what I have here is the model class 1, and I give it the ID from the model, which is class 1, and has a extension method called external ID. I think that's the one that resides here. That's why I have that usage. And then I've added an input for this attribute 1. And here's an action link that has the label add class 2 and calls the action add class 2 and sends in the identity for this object, class 1 object. And here I follow the link from class 1 to class 2's. It's this one. And then I write out the names from those in a sort of table. And then there's an input button that's gonna call this form submit, and it's gonna call this action submit single object. So let's run this to see how it behaves. Comes up here on the other screen. So like this. So this is the intra-page objects directly. So this was the object that was created for me in, let's put a, if I refresh this page, I will get a new object. And if I step here, I can see that the attribute 1, let's just never mind. Let's resume this with F5. And if I press add class 2, we call an action called add class 2. So this is sort of the classic round trip when doing MVC. The action calls the application that routes it to the right controller and sends in any parameters that I have sent in. So this is the identity of this. I then have an extension or rather a method on my base controller called object for ID and sending in the type that I expect it to be. So if I step over this and I see that I got the C1 back, and then I can follow the link to class 2 and add a new class 2 and set the name of the class 2 to something, and then I commit it to save it, and then I return to the view. Yeah. So doing this will create new tools here, and if I change this one and press apply, I will get to here, submit single object, and apply. And what's I get the IDs. I know what persistent object to look up, an object that already exists. But I also get an offline object with any attributes that we have on the class. So, and then I can do the apply. So the apply sort of takes the offline object and moves all the properties to the persistent one. And then I save that and return to the view. So let's F5 this. So when I change stuff here and apply, that's applied and saved. So that's the basic case with the just accessing the objects from the model. Then we have the view model, and in our case it sort of looks like this. Let's see. Yeah, so as this is not a video on view models, we have plenty of those, but just to show a point, I can easily save this and restart the application, I guess. And nothing changed because this renders with Bootstrap and everything is laid out like this anyway. What we probably want to do is to render it with some CSS Grid instead. So let's see. I'm gonna look up the controller for this one. And apply the code changes. I'm gonna restart it. And now I get, so the round trip and recreation, and if I select one of these, I just made some little something in the view model that this attribute, if its self is vCurrent, then draw this, otherwise don't. So that's the arrow we see there. And so that's one way to get the ViewModel working and let's see how the controller for that is created. ViewModel controller. So same here, model driven controller base, and sending in our type for the ecospace. And as I added this to render it as CSS Grid instead of Bootstrap. And the only thing that I need to do is to wake it up initially, sending in the name of the view model and the route to the view, and after that I don't really need to do anything else because the post back and things is handled by the model driven controller. And if I were to move these things around to like this, and saving. Saving and rebuilding. If I select this one and add yes. Alright, so what's with this then? Very little in the controller, but in the view we need a few things. Maybe you didn't see that before, the view. So the action submit, so the post back in the controller is in the base class controller is called submit, so gotta match that one. And we also probably need to have these hidden fields so that we can round trip it, that the external ID and the view model name. And this is the submit button to trigger the submit action. And this actually renders all the view model content by calling this extension. To get the RACI code for the view model from the view model design, and sends that into a partial page rendering, and that's it. Then you get the whole thing. Of course, you don't need to do this. You can access the data within the view model, but that's trickier to do as the view model is just in a VM class, very generic. So it has properties, but you need to sort of index them like this to get to the values. Then a better solution would to code generate this view model, and that's easy to do. Just check this box, and in the when we generate the code, we get this file, which is the view model, sample view model. And this is the generated code of this view model, and it has all the properties that we design on the view model and the actions, etc., to strongly typed. So that's one way to do it, and that leads us into the third option in this simple model, the strongly typed view model. And it looks the same, but the controller is different. Let's look at the controller, the strongly typed view model. It's not that different, but it still has the model-driven controller base, sending in the echo space. We send in these parameters to override the default behavior. We wanted to keep the view name and the display action name as view instead of, this is called generic view model, and this is, or generic view default, I think. Let's see. There should be a comment here somewhere. I don't know where that went. We will comment there before. And this display action name is called, that's the one that's called submit. So we recreate the view model class, and now we actually create the sample view model, which was the generated one. We send in the eco space, or at least the eco service provider, and we send in the root object of this one. So we have overridden this recreate VM class to make it return our typed variant instead of the generic VM class. And as we enter the index, we create the root, and then we ask the controller to display this view model with this external ID, and that in turn will eventually call this one. And since the display has been instructed that the name for the view is view, we will end up here with the view. No, wrong. At least when we get back in the post back, we will end up here. And then we have to do the model binder of the VM class binder as a sample view model. We need to return it as the type here, and then we can just do submit on the whole view model, and that will resolve any changes that we have to fields, and commit to save, and then return to view. And this extension method was needed, I discovered, to actually generate the razor for the strongly typed type. So this is normally for VM class, but currently we need this one. So that concludes the examples, but I need to describe what we did in the application startup as well. So we had a memory cache to hold the shelved echo spaces to increase the speed when we round trip things. We also add this one to suppress child validation metadata provider, because on this type VM class, this is the base class for view models. Without this, when we round trip the view model, the validation logic went into the subclasses of VM class and tried to validate all kind of stuff. I don't quite know why it did that, but so we need this one. And then we have a session state temp data provider and a session to hold the selections, etc. during round trip, so that that is managed that way. And then we have this rather complicated construct to handle the file providers, because there's nothing stored on disk when we generate the Razor files. It's all in memory, but there's something called a file provider to handle that. And we also need to be able to, in runtime, actually compile the Razor data, and we needed this service for that. And here we just add a use session thing, I guess. Yeah, so this is it. I will take this sample and upload it to this page here on, yeah, I can log out so you see it as to this page. It describes some of the new things, and the whole startup class is just copied in here so that you have it, and also how you set up the ecospace with this. I'm gonna add this example as a zip file here so you can check that out. Also, I forgot to say that in the to make the ViewModel logic work with select, etc., there's a few JavaScript functions that are needed, and I just pasted them in here on this page. A better option would to extend them into their own file, but what this does, the submit action, it checks if there's a question on if you're sure that you want to navigate, and if it is, it's just calls the submit. So I guess that one is easy to remove, but we have a few things here that you probably want, and that's how to handle selection. So setting the current row, etc., to adding CSS classes, etc., to the rows to make selection show. And of course this is completely unstyled, so there's things to do with that as well. Thanks for listening.